Grandpa, can you hear me? Grandpa, I can't hear you. You're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can. I can. This is
Okay.
cool.
How are you?
I'm all right. You know,
I look kind of dark here. I don't know. Can you see me?
yeah, I can see you fine. Yeah,
Okay.
I gotta pull up my my questions. I forgot to send them to you, but oh well.
That's okay. Be more spontaneous.
Yeah. All right, where are you right now?
I'm sitting in the upstairs playroom where the TV is.
Oh, okay. I
You can
see.
see the windows behind me there.
Okay, got it. All right, so you ready for this?
Yes, I am.
All right, cool. So I guess we can start right at the beginning. Where were you born? Where did you grow up?
Well, I was born in a hospital in the Bronx, New York, and my I don't recall if my parents were living in the Bronx at that time, but but I, we moved to the borough of Queens in New York City, where my father had his business, and that's where I lived, all the way through up into my teen years until I graduated from high school, and then my parents moved to Florida. But that's where I grew up. I grew up in New York City. Went to kindergarten, grade school, high school, and then after graduating from high school in 1950, we moved to South Florida, to Miami.
And what year were you born? 33?
In 1933.
33.
That makes me 87. Can you imagine that?
You'd never look a shade above 60, Grandpa.
Thank you. Thank you. That'll get you far with me.
So you said your dad had a business. Can you talk about a bit what that business was like?
Yeah, yes. I'll tell you. My father and his brother, my uncle Ben, my father had 5 siblings. There were 6 children in his family when he, in Europe, where he was born. So anyway, one of his brothers, my father was the eldest of all those 6 children. So one of his brothers, Ben, and my dad were the co-owners of a store which is sort of unique to New York City. It was at a strategic subway station stop. It was near a subway station. And so it sold newspapers, stationery items, greeting cards, cigarettes, cigars, magazines. And so when people went to work in the morning, they would stop, buy a newspaper or some other items. And then at the end of the day, when they came back from work from the subway, they would, maybe buy an afternoon paper and something else they might want to take with them. So it was like a small variety store, but it was basically, mostly newspapers, cigarettes and cigars and magazines and greeting cards. That's the store. So it was open, 6 days a week, and it was hard work. I had to get there early in the morning. The newspapers were delivered. They had to take them off the trucks and put them on the newsstands, and then they were there all day. And my dad would, come home in the early evening for dinner. So I would see him mostly at night, after he came back work. So that was the business that they had for many years
and your mother
until we
helped
left
out?
for Florida.
And your mother helped out with the business?
My mother, no, my mother was strictly a homemaker. She was home taking care of, of whatever needed to be done, preparing meals, worrying about me, and always worried about Now I had an older brother, and he was we shared a bedroom in this apartment in the borough of Queens, and but him being 9 years older than me, uh, he went off to college. He went to college at New York University. After he graduated from there, he lived at home while he was in college, and we shared that bedroom. And he left and went to Columbus, Ohio, and got his master's degree in psychology at Ohio State University, and then gradually moved to Boston to get his PhD, and that's where he continued to live in Boston.
Yeah.
But
Well,
so my mother took. Go ahead.
Oh no, you can keep going. You keep going.
No, I was just telling you that. So so my mother, basically prepared the meals. My father's sister, my Aunt Fanny, lived just a few blocks from where we lived in Queens. And so my mother would visit with the family, during the day, and took care of things around the house. My mother never worked in the store that I can recall. My brother helped out. He was older than me and was able to be of some help. I occasionally helped when I got to be, high school age. But mainly it was my father and my Uncle Ben that ran the business.
Got it. And so, would you say you had a close relationship with your parents, or was it a little bit like, more disconnected than it would be today?
Okay. I would say that I was very close to my mother because she was around all the time. My father, my father's relationship with me was one that he was a real strict disciplinarian, and he was very interested in me succeeding in school, and he was always uh, after me to do my homework, which wasn't very hard to do. I was a good student, and I liked school. But my father, uh, I would say, compared to my relationship with my children, I would say my father was a bit distant. I don't recall having any, really meaningful, important discussions with him about anything, in life or anything like that. Uh, but I would say, much closer to my mother, who was around all the time, as I said before. My dad was busy at work. He came home. He was tired, at the end of the day. And so there wasn't a lot of big conversation between him and me most of the time.
Yeah. And so you lived in Queens for the majority of your childhood. So that's obviously a pretty Jewish section. So how was your life Jewishly as a family? Like how did you practice? Like what were your
Okay.
observances and such?
Okay. Uh, well, I had my bar mitzvah in the conservative synagogue that was in our neighborhood. That's where I went, to Hebrew school until my bar mitzvah. And but once my bar mitzvah was finished, that was the end of any Jewish education. Uh, that was sort of the way it was for our.
Oh, hello? Hmm. Interesting. Oh, we lost him. And your video's off, Grandpa.
Video is off.
There should be something that says a video. So you just turned off your microphone. You want to keep that on. But it should say, are you on your computer right now? All right. Oh, you're okay. Okay, there we go. Your microphone's off though. I can't hear you. No.
Do you hear me now?
Yes, I can. I can.
Do you hear me now?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Great. So, what were we talking about? Oh yeah. So you're talking about your Jewish observances when you were a kid.
Yeah, that the family observed all the major holidays, but we did not go to synagogue regularly on the Sabbath.
Yeah, and
My
like what
father
you do
was
for like
working.
what you do for like a Passover or like the high holidays and that kind of stuff.
Well, for Passover, it was always a tradition to go to my Aunt Fanny's. This is one of my father's sisters, my Aunt Fanny, lived a few blocks from where we lived. And Passover Seder was always held at their home, and it was a lot of my cousins were there, my uncles and aunts. It was a big occasion. So we celebrated the Seders there. And then we observed, the 8 days of the holiday, like everyone else did. But that's how we observed that holiday.
Yeah. And so if you could describe, like, how would you describe your both your parents, your mom and your dad, if you could use a few descriptors or just some stories that maybe like give me a sense of what they were like.
Well, my father, as I mentioned, was a hardworking businessman, and he was always concerned about both my brother and I succeeding in life. That was rather typical, I think, of persons who grew up in Europe and wanted their children to have a better life, than they did, growing up. And so he was always concerned about my grades, and always was glad to see that the grades were usually good. And and as I mentioned, he was a very good father in that respect. We never wanted for anything, and had a reasonably middle class kind of life. And but as I mentioned, there wasn't a lot of discussions and conversations that we had about anything going on in the world or anything like that. Well, I mean, during World War II, there were a lot of concerns about the fact that there were still family members in Europe. And I know that the family sent packages to people and tried to get in touch with people when the war was over to see who survived. So they were always concerned about that. My mother, was, I mentioned, a wonderful, housekeeper, and always caring for me, always overly concerned about both my brother and I. And she did things around the house, went shopping, loved going to the movies, and enjoyed life as best she could during the war. And then we moved, to South Florida, where shortly after living there for a year or so, my father died. And he had not the best of health. And so my mother and I took care of the fact that we had owned an apartment house on Miami Beach. That was the transition to owning a small business in New York to owning an apartment house on Miami Beach. And that's where my mother and I took care of the apartment house while I started college. And so we had an apartment in the apartment house and had tenants there. And we maintained, the place. We had a handyman, but we took care of the building and the rental of apartments. And that's what my mother did at that phase of her life, until we sold the apartment house.
Yeah. And so obviously there's a big age difference between you and Uncle Norman. Um, did you like how'd you get along and also did he go to fight in the war when you were younger?
No, no, no. I was when my brother went when he was called for the draft. I was very proud of the fact that a brother of mine, might serve in the army. There was a lot of feeling of patriotism. Uh, that same feeling was not shared by my parents, who were not excited about a son of theirs going off to the war. So he goes and has his physical exam, and he flunked it because he had flat feet. His feet did not have good arches to them. And at that point in time, that was apparently something that they felt he would not be able to do the Army basic training and everything properly. They might have trouble with his feet. So he was declared 4F. I was disappointed, but my parents had a sigh of relief, that he would not go in the Army. So my brother, as I mentioned, after finishing college in New York City, went off to Ohio State and then Boston, and he sort of never came home again, in the sense that once he left for graduate school, the relationship changed. He just came occasionally to visit us. And he himself got married, in Boston, and had a wonderful marriage and had a wonderful wife. That's Aunt Sheila. And then he unfortunately died of pancreatic cancer about 8 years ago.
Yeah. So you were talking about moving from Miami to Miami from New York. And first I
Yes.
just wanted to ask, like, what did you like about your life in New York before you moved?
Well, I found living in New York exciting, even at that age. I had a good friend my age who we went to school with, and he and I loved on weekends, on a Saturday or Sunday, to take the subway into Manhattan and just walk around, look at the sights, and just had a wonderful enjoyment of all the cultural things that New York had to offer. We couldn't afford to go to like Broadway shows particularly, but if you went to a movie theater like the Radio City Music Hall, you had an amazing experience to see a movie and a show. And so my parents often did that. And my parents also belonged to some organizations that had to do with families from Europe that they sort of supported this organization. And we would meet on Sundays once a month or every couple of months to get together with these people from Europe who now lived in New York City, who came from the same area of Russia where my parents came from. So they did have that kind of organization of Jews from Europe that sort of were bound together by their past. But anyway, I loved New York City and the easy way of just taking a subway, which cost 5 cents at that time, and then I had friends where I lived, and that learned how to ride a bicycle, and I just had good friends that I enjoyed being with. So life was pretty good, living in New York City. So I enjoyed it. I really did. But moving to Miami Beach was quite a major transition. You move from a city of hustle and bustle and different weather changes, winter and spring and summer and fall, to an area in South Florida, which was all golden sunshine, beaches, palm trees. It was quite a difference living in the casual beauty of South Florida. And I liked living there a lot, made new friends. This is when I started college, of course, and made new friends. And I loved living in Florida. I still enjoy Florida, and probably would have stayed there if your grandmother didn't hate it so much. So,
So I did want to ask you about Florida. What were your feeling? Well, first off, how old were you when you moved?
I was about 17 or 18, I think.
So you were about to be a senior in high school?
No, I graduated from high school.
Oh, you had already graduated.
I graduated.
So what were your feelings about moving out of New York, the place you'd lived your whole life?
Well, they were mixed. I had all these friends, there. Uh, in high school, I had a girlfriend who I took to our senior prom, and so I was leaving my friends to go to a whole new part of the country. We had been to Florida, though, a couple of times before, because my father actually was down there leasing hotels for the winter season for a couple of years. So he left the business with my Uncle Ben, that store that they owned. And he was advised to move to South Florida because he didn't have the best of health. He had a heart condition and smoked too much and had a lung congestion. So his doctor said he should move to Florida. And so he went down there, and he wanted us to move 2 years before I even graduated high school, but I insisted that I wanted to stay in high school and finish in New York, because I was afraid that the high schools in Florida, being the South, were behind New York in education. And so he agreed. My mother and I continued to live in Queens until I finished high school. And then we moved, to Florida. And but I loved living there. It was. I did leave our family behind. Everybody was up there in the Northeast, all my cousins and uncles and aunts. But it was like an adventure, and I did enjoy the weather and the sort of subtropical climate. And then I started college, which was another new adventure at that time. So it helped to distract me from leaving New York. So I was not overwhelmingly disappointed at leaving. I think I looked forward to this being a new phase in my life, living in the South, which was quite different. When I went to a Woolworth variety store to get something, and I wanted a drink of water, I went to the fountain area, and I noticed that one fountain had a sign that said for colored people, and one sign said for white people. That was something incredulous to me. So I figured, well, I'm just going to drink from the colored fountain. What difference does it make? And when I did that, one of the salespersons came up to me and said, "Sonny, don't drink from that fountain. That water is not for you. That's for black people." So that's when I first began to realize what segregation was like, down, because certainly the high school I went to was not, or the grade school, they were not segregated, and we did have.
What's the name of your high school?
Pardon me? It was called Long Island City High School. It was
Long Island City High School.
Yeah, it was in Queens. Yeah.
Got it. That's fascinating. I didn't even think about that. And I think you've told me this once before, but how exactly did you make your decision to go to the University of Miami?
Well, the decision was made by my father, who said, I said, "Dad, I'd like to go to college in the Northeast. I've done well, and I'd like to go back up there to one of the better schools." he said, "I'm sorry, but I can't afford for you to go to college up there. You'll have to go to a local school." I said, "But Dad, this school is sort of like had a reputation of being sort of a playboy type of school. Families would send their children down there to go to college to kind of have a good time and maybe get a degree in business and come back to New York and maybe go into a family business back there." I didn't like the idea of that school, and it was school it wasn't brand new. It was started in 1925. This was 1950. It was only 25 years old, and but my father insisted that that's where I had to go. So, much to my surprise, once I started school there, I discovered that we had some very wonderful teachers and professors there. Many of the faculty were people who were attracted to the climate of South Florida. So they came from good institutions in the Northeast and other parts of the country to the challenge of being in a school in South Florida and trying to improve it academically by them coming down there from good schools. So I had a wonderful college education. I really did, and so my father's decision turned out to be a good one.
Yeah. And I was wondering, not just in college, but also high school and grade school. What were your interests in school, extracurricular and subjects as well?
Well, one of the things that in grade school there weren't really any other activities. You went to school and you came home and studied and went back to school the next day, and so there weren't many opportunities to do much of anything. Um, but in high school, I was very interested in journalism, so I joined the school newspaper, and eventually, my senior year, became the editor of the paper. I loved covering, and you'll appreciate this, Eli. I started off writing sports articles for the paper. We had a very, very good um, uh, basketball team. The school yard was all concrete. There was a facility there for like a softball or a baseball team. There's nothing like that in that particular school. But basketball was the sport of that school, and they had a very good team. So, I would interview the players and write about the games that they played. They actually were in the city playoffs and played in Madison Square Garden. And that was really exciting to have a pass that took me into where the sports writers were, so I could observe the game and write about it. That was very exciting. So sports writing was something I was very, it was fun creating the paper, and so I advanced to becoming associate editor and then editor of the paper. I was also on the track team in high school and took part in a couple of city meets. I never did that well, but I enjoyed the training. Uh, we trained at a track on. We didn't have a track at school, but there's an area called Randall's Island. Sits in between the two boroughs, and so we would go there to practice. So I did enjoy the track team, but my last year of high school, I was so busy with academic pursuits, running the newspaper, that I didn't play on the track team. I didn't participate in the track team my last year, but I did really enjoy high school very, very much. I had very good teachers.
And then when you got to college, what was your major?
Well, I started off majoring in journalism because that's what I enjoyed. So I went. They had a guidance counselor who you'd sit with right at the beginning of school during orientation, and they'd kind of ask you what your interests were and to see what you wanted to do in college. So I told them about my journalism career in high school, and well, why don't you join the paper here? And and they take English subjects and take the core curriculum, and and kind of get a well balanced number of subjects and see what it's like. in journalism. So from being the editor of the high school paper, I became, just another reporter. So I did do some sports reporting. Then I began to think that, well, what was I going to do with sports as a career? I thought I was a pretty good writer, but I wasn't sure that I'd enjoy being working for the Peoria, Illinois, newspaper, doing maybe some minor things. So I began to think uh, of another career. So in talking to the guidance people, after a while, um, they said, "Have you ever considered anything in the sciences? Medicine?" No, no. Why not? I can't stand the sight of blood, I told the guidance counselor, which was true. Was I squeamish? If I got a cut on my finger, I'd probably almost pass out. So he said, "Look, why don't you take a couple of science courses, take chemistry, take a biology course, see what, maybe you enjoy it." I said, "Well, okay, but I don't see medicine as a career." Well, you know the end of the story. I found science fascinating. Uh, I was still queasy about blood, but managed to overcome that and went on to pre-med studies, and did well, and eventually went into medicine. So I'm very grateful to the University of Miami. I didn't want to go there, but they guided me correctly, good people advising me. And I had, as a result of all of that, a wonderful career, in medicine over the years. Very, very fortunate, very blessed.
So the way you got interested in dermatology was just kind of, you were just kind of pushed in that direction and you just kind of kept going with
Well,
it?
I'll tell you that's an interesting story too. Um, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do as far as, to go into just internal medicine, or I didn't think surgery would be for me. Again, a little bit of aversion to blood, that still was with me early in my career. So I talked to a friend of mine, a classmate, and I asked him what he was planning to do as far as getting getting a summer job, in some area of medicine. And he told me that he was going over to the dermatology department to work there for the summer. I said, "Dermatology? I never thought of that." He said, "Well, his father-in-law was a dermatologist in Savannah, Georgia. And so he encouraged my classmate, Mike, to go to the department head. And of course, he'd heard about the professor of dermatology being a very innovative scientist who was doing a lot of very interesting work in dermatology and basic science. So I said, Mike said, "Come with me." I said, "Well, okay." So I went there and I met the professor, and he showed me around and the lab, what they were doing. And he said, "If you're interested, we have some openings for people to do some work, and maybe I see what you like." And so that's what happened. I got a summer job there and I got paid for it, which was nice. And I found out that dermatology really had a lot of fascination for me. And I continued to work in the department, part-time while I was in medical school in the summers, and then applied for the residency. And because the doctor there, the professor, knew me, I was fortunate to be accepted into the program. And so I was there it's a 3-year residency. I was there for 2 years. And then your grandmother was worried that if I finished my training there, we might just end up in South Florida, because it would be, I was, got to know the professors. They got to know the doctors who practice dermatology in the Miami area. I think I could have gotten off to a good start practicing dermatology. So I agreed to leave the program there, which wasn't easy to do. It was hard to tell the professor that I was leaving. And we went to Atlanta, where I got accepted for my final year at Emory University. And, of course, we stayed in Atlanta, which I don't regret. I would have enjoyed, I think, living in South Florida, but your grandmother was very, very happy in Atlanta. Her sister lived here,
Yeah.
Aunt Roz. So that was a great inducement to be in Atlanta. And it was a nice place to live. It has been a nice place to live. So that's how I finished my career in Atlanta.
So I was wondering actually now if we could go a bit back again to when you were younger. What did you do with your your Christmas vacations, the summers? Like, did you ever go away? Maybe it's like the Catskills or something like that.
Okay. Well, okay. Well, when I was younger, the family, and I've realized as an adult how fortunate I was. The family would go in the summertime to either a place in the Catskill Mountains of upstate New York, and they would rent apartments or places there. And my other cousins and myself and my aunts and my mother would go to these places in the mountains where they would cook meals, and you'd play with friends you've made there and your cousins. And we spent, I can't recall how long, but I think it may have been at almost a month, that we would spend up in the mountains. Or on alternate summers, we went to Rockaway Beach, in Queens, where they would rent, rooms in houses that were there very close to the beach. And every day we'd walk over to the beach and enjoy the company of friends and my cousins, my mother, and we would go to the beach, and do things there. So I was very fortunate that we were able to get out of the city for those parts of the year. And my father would come up on weekends, after the business was closed for the weekend, and he would come up and we'd see him on the weekend. So even in the summers, I didn't see much of my father, and but we had wonderful, wonderful opportunities to spend time, in those areas with my cousins and other friends that we made in the summertime in these two areas.
And so your family, like, you were very tight knit then, and like a big Jewish family.
Very close.
Yeah.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. Very close to my aunts and uncles and cousins. And
yeah,
if I ever was ill with something, I had a maiden aunt who never married, one of my father's sisters, and she would come over to the house to make sure my mother was taking good care of me, and they were all very concerned family members.
that's nice. And
Mother didn't like that much, but they came.
And so I was wondering if you could tell me a bit about like your parents' lives before they came to America, maybe where the Goldstein name originated. Like what did they tell you anything about life in Europe?
Well, what's interesting about that is that the only time I heard a little bit about life in Europe was during World War II, when they were concerned about family members who were still there, had not come to the United States. But from what I gather, my father's family, they lived in a small village it was either what's now called Ukraine or Belarus. It was close to the Polish border, because I know my mother had friends that lived in Poland, which was just across the border, not far from where they lived. So my mother and my father lived in the same area. And my mother when when she was a young girl, her my mother's mother died, and her father, I'm not sure what he did, but her father didn't feel he was capable of raising her and taking care of her by himself. So he sent her, and I think it was over to Poland, to where a relative lived, a cousin or something like that. Um, uh, do you remember my cousin Claire Boren? Do you that name? You don't know them.
Oh.
Well, okay. Well, Claire lives in New Jersey. But anyway, so my mother went and lived with this cousin who raised her for a number of years until my mother's father remarried and had two children, two daughters. So my mother had two stepsisters, and she came back and lived with her father again, after he had remarried and the two stepsisters. My mother had a fairly good education for what was offered there. She knew a bunch of people who were interested in literature and poetry, and so she had a decent education for those circumstances. So my father lived in the same community, I believe,
Was it just like
small
a shtetl
town.
or something? Was it like, some very Jewish town?
Yes, yeah, very Jewish, very Jewish. And yeah, I think that they had either my mother's family or my father's family had like a mill where they would grind, wheat and everything to make flour. One of the families had that. I'm not sure if it was my father's family or my mother's family. And and they had kind of menial kinds of work there, I guess. But they lived and and were able to support. My father's family had all those siblings. My mother didn't have anyone at all until she and moved over to stay with her cousin until she came back. So my father, when he was 17, he was the oldest of all the children. He got notice that he was going to be drafted into the Russian army, which was not a great place for a young Jewish man. So, and this is something I regret not ever asking my father about, but somehow or another, he decided to leave Russia to escape the possibility of going in the army, which would have been horrible, apparently. He made his way, and somehow he got to the port of Danzig, and on the coast of I think Germany somewhere, and he got on a ship and came by himself to the United States.
Through Ellis Island?
He came to Ellis Island and got into the United States, and he worked here in the United States. He was a Hebrew school teacher for a little while. He had very nice penmanship. He had beautiful handwriting, and but he had known my mother in Europe and had proposed to her to come marry him. She didn't want to do it. She thought that life was fairly decent there in Russia, and so she rejected him initially. But evidently, things, whatever the reasons were, she decided to change her mind and marry my father. And so she got passage on a ship herself to America, came to Ellis Island, and my father and his brother, my Uncle Ben, met her there, and they had a civil wedding on Ellis Island so she could come into the country.
Wow.
And then they had a Jewish wedding a little bit later. So that's how she got to this country thankfully, because she never evidently never heard whatever happened to her father, his wife, and her sisters. They used to correspond. I still have some of the postcards in my possession of correspondence between my mother and her stepsisters. We assume they were all killed, during the Holocaust.
Yeah. And
So,
what were the names of your grandparents? Do you know their names?
pardon?
The names of your grandparents.
My father's. I'm trying to think. My father's father's name was Isaac, and my grandmother's name escapes me right now, and I don't know the names of my mother's. My mother's father. I don't know those names.
Do you know your mother's maiden name?
Steinberg.
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 Yeah, I have been curious ever since, as you know, I did that whole thing with my mom's mother. I was wondering about the Goldstein name, where it originated, because you hear Goldstein, you kind of think German. I'm just wondering aloud, I guess, where did it actually come from?
Yeah. Well, that certainly is not a typical Russian name, Goldstein. But it's really unknown to me where the family originally, came from. I have a feeling that it was Germany, and there was a period of time where many German Jews were migrating east. They were welcomed, into Russia. I think it was around maybe the time of Catherine the Great, and it's possible that they migrated, centuries ago to Russia for whatever opportunity presented itself. But that part of my family background is unknown. It just never will be known.
But our name was never changed at Ellis Island.
No. It was always Goldstein.
Cool.
It was always Goldstein.
I was gonna ask something, and then it slipped my mind. It was gonna be something about your parents. It'll come back to me.
Okay.
Most of your you said your mother's family perished in the Holocaust.
Yes.
Yes. But you said you only spoke
except for this cousin of her, her name was my mother learned after the war that family that where my mother was sent to, when my father's when her father when her mother died, when she went to I think it was to Poland, and was taken care of for a number of years. That family survived. And her cousin survived. She grew up with that cousin, and they came to the United States, and they stayed. This is something that I didn't mention before. The year before we left New York to go to Miami Beach, this family that survived came to New York. We were able to get them to America, and they came and they lived with us in our apartment in New York. And so there was Nunya, there was her husband Rachmiel, and two daughters. So one daughter lives in Massachusetts. Her name is Bina. She was about 5 years old when she came. And her sister Claire was about 12. So the two girls and the parents lived with us in our apartment. My father wasn't there any longer. He was down in Florida, running some things down there. And so they lived they took my bedroom, the two girls, uh, the other part, the husband and wife, lived in my mother's bedroom, and my mother and I lived in the living room on two portable cots, sort of thing. But it was just for a few months, and then then we left for Miami. But they didn't speak much English. But Claire went on to a wonderful life with her husband, and he was also a survivor, and he died a few years ago, and she was very well to do as a result of his business ventures, and Bina is married to a psychiatrist and lives in Massachusetts, and we're in touch with them,
Yeah. And what languages did your parents speak?
Yiddish.
So
They
they
spoke
spoke with
Yiddish.
do they speak English with like thick accents to you?
My mother had my father's accent was not as prominent as my mother's, because my father, after he came here, um, he again, he came here as 17 or 18 years old, and World War One broke out. He came before World War One, and he served in the army in France. So he was around a lot of people who spoke English and everything. So his English was quite good. My mother, her English got to be good too, but she did have, you knew that she was not a native, American,
Yeah.
But they spoke Yiddish at home, and I went to a Yiddish school before I started Hebrew school, Workman's Circle it was called, and I learned Yiddish too, and so I could understand Yiddish, quite well, and then eventually I went to Hebrew school.
But you could never speak it.
Just little phrases here and there, but not have a really good conversation. No.
Yeah. And did your mother make any like particular like of your like what were your favorite meals when you were growing up? What'd she make for you?
Well, my one of my father's sisters in Queens, my Aunt Fanny, was married to a kosher butcher. So we had, even during World War II, where there was rationing of food, you had ration stamps, and you couldn't, you had you had to be careful about what you bought. But we always had food because of my uncle being a kosher butcher. But my favorite foods were meat, were lamb chops and steak. We were lucky enough to have things like that, chicken. So those, we had just regular fare. There was nothing that special. I mean, everything was pretty good, but I really didn't understand what food truly tastes like until I met my future wife and I got married. Then I got a taste of New Orleans style seasoning, and that food really could have a lot of flavor. My mother's cooking was very plain,
Yeah.
and not very seasoned.
And so you were saying obviously about your sport journalism. I think you might have told me this once that you went to Yankee Stadium with Uncle Norman.
Yes, that was the first baseball game I ever saw. That was a magical experience to sit up there, and I think we're out there in center field because the famous Joe DiMaggio was down there in center field below us. But it was a sunshiny day, all that green grass of the field, the baseball itself, the game itself, all the crowd. It was wonderful. So of course my favorite team became the New York Yankees, having been there for the first time, at a Yankee game, and it continued to be my favorite team as long as I lived in New York City, and then came to Atlanta when the Atlanta Braves became my favorite team. But yes, so he took me to that game, and
Did you
I
have
don't
any
recall
sports memories?
other sports memories. Well, I think I told you the other sports memories were when I was working as a sports reporter for my high school newspaper, and going to some of the basketball games and some of the tournaments that my high school team was in. But also, we liked going to some of the hockey games, the Rangers, and we would get inexpensive seats way up in the top of Madison Square Garden, and hockey was very, very exciting to watch. And then my brother took me to some of New York University had a very good basketball team at that time when my brother was at NYU, and he took me to some of the basketball games, and that was also lots and lots of fun watching basketball there. So basketball, hockey, these were, and baseball were New York sports, and professional football was nothing at that time.
Yeah,
And,
yeah. So, okay, I have an idea. So I don't want to keep you on for like too much longer, but I feel like maybe we should do like a second half of the interview on another day.
I'd be happy to.
Okay, great. So I'm just gonna ask you a couple more, and then you can go, and we'll do this and then we'll finish it another time. But here's a pretty light and probably really difficult question. Top 5 places that you've traveled, in all your years of traveling around the globe.
Well, number 1 was Israel. Okay. I'd say number 2 was Italy. Okay. Number 3 would be Australia. Okay. Number 4, I think, would be France. And number 5 would be Iceland.
And what's the strangest place that you might have regretted going to?
Dreaded going to?
Yeah.
Well, in 1972, your grandmother and I went to the Soviet Union on a mission to be of help and bring information and other items to the Soviet Jews who were, having a very difficult time during those years. And so we went with a Soviet Jewry organization sponsored trip, flying Russian airline to Moscow. That was a bit spooky, and especially after we got there, we've discovered that when you come to Russia in those days, when you leave, getting ready to leave the airport, they go through your luggage. You have to open up your luggage. And they found a lot of the items, prayer books, tallis, other kinds of religious items that we were bringing for Jews there, and other articles and books, the Diary of Anne Frank, things like that. So when they discovered that, they took us out of the line and interrogated us for a period of time, both your grandmother and myself. That was kind of spooky.
I can imagine that Gran.
And
she wouldn't back down.
Well, actually, what they did was they said, they want to talk to me. We want to talk to you. So they started to take me away. So Gran said, wait a minute, I'm going with you. Well, no, we just want to talk to him. No, I'm going with you too. And she insisted. So she came into the room where they questioned us both about why we were coming to the Soviet Union, who were we going to see, and this and that. That was really spooky. And we were with a group of other people. It was a group tour, and people were on the bus already, and we were delaying the whole departure from the airport, and that was a very scary beginning. And then we had a lot of other experiences because they were watching us. They had their eye on us because of what they found that we had, and they confiscated some of the items, wouldn't let us bring them in. So that was probably the most uncomfortable experience I've ever had traveling. But I'll tell you though, Eli, when I think of all the trips we've taken over so many years, every one of them was positive and good. We never really ever had much of any bad experience. We're very, very fortunate. One time, I must say, it was a little tricky when we were in Holland and Amsterdam, and one of the volcanoes in Iceland exploded. This was a number of years ago, and all of that ash and smoke moved eastward from Iceland and affected Europe. And we were supposed to leave, and the flights were all delayed, and we had to do a lot of manipulating and traveling, going to other places to find an airline that would take us, back to the States, and we finally did. So that was another kind of a spooky experience. But most everything else that we've ever experienced while traveling has been very, very good.
Yeah. Okay. Now my last question.
Here? Can you sit someplace else?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So my last
Let me
question.
say hello.
Hi, Gran.
Gran wants to say hello.
Hi, Eli.
Oh, Gran,
How are
did you get
you?
your hair done?
Doing okay?
Yeah. Gran, did you get your hair done?
I'm going on Wednesday. What about you?
Oh, no,
What?
not anytime soon.
What about you? Are you going to have your hair cut?
Hopefully soon.
I don't know if you can hear me.
Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Soon.
Oh, soon. Okay, good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Last. Okay.
Yeah, last
What's
question.
your last question?
So obviously, this is a timely question because of his passing recently. What do you remember about meeting Don Shula?
Meeting Don Shula?
Yeah.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Well, okay. Well, it was just, I think, we were coming back from a cruise, and he was on the cruise as a guest lecturer. And so the flight was delayed after leaving the ship, and we were in the airport, just hanging out, and he was sitting there. And if I recall correctly, I went and I talked to him about the fact that I'd gone to school at Miami and this and that, and we had he was very nice, and we had a nice little chat. And I was sorry to hear that he had passed away just a few days ago, and but that was it. It was sort of a minor kind of meeting with him, but we had a nice chat, and that was fun. I enjoyed that.
Yeah. All right. Great. So let's pause